Hi everybody and welcome to Mark Overanalyzes Film. Today I will be discussing 2021's The Worst Person in the World. Before I begin, a brief reminder that I am available for story coaching and reading and that kind of thing at markoveranalyzesstory.com. Also, there's going to be a lot of butchered pronunciation of Norwegian names here, so I apologize in advance. The Worst Person in the World was directed by Joachim von Trier, if that's how you pronounce it, who co-wrote the script with Eskil Vogt. I think it's probably valuable to note as well that the whole story was based on a conversation that von Trier had with the lead actress Renate Reinsve years earlier, and she was apparently consulted throughout. It seems like such a nice story, as Reinsve has stated that before von Trier approached her about this film, she was about to give up acting altogether and focus on carpentry, just like Harrison Ford. So that's film 2, Carpentry 0. Now, I found The Worst Person in the World a little challenging to overanalyze. On the one hand, those who like it adore it. The protagonist Yulia is a special character who really seems to represent a lot of struggles for a lot of people. And her problems and concerns feel, well, generational. On the other hand, critics of the film say that Reinsve's performance in this role covers a lack of depth in the character and story, and that there's no real character arc. So, do the critics have a point? Or are these critics missing the essential nature of who Yulia is and what this story is really about? With all that in mind, first I'll look at the fundamental features of the protagonist, and then I'll go through the main story beats by looking at the sequences of the film. Then I'll talk about the main things I learned along the way. So, let's get into the 5 questions about the protagonist. Question 1, whose story is it? This is the story of Yulia, a Norwegian woman whom we follow from her early 20s to her early 30s. If you asked Yulia one day, she might describe herself as, impetuous and courageous. The next day she might say flaky and cowardly. But one way or another, time keeps ticking by, and there are questions about what she wants to do and who she really wants to be that just will not go away. Question 2, what is her life dream? So, life dream here refers to what it is that the protagonist wants to do or is aiming to do when the film begins and the story has yet to properly start. When we meet Yulia first, really she's looking for a calling, I think. She starts out studying medicine, then moves into psychology, then moves from that into photography. Now, later, I think there's a reason to believe that both of these switches were justified, but possibly as a coincidence and possibly not, there is also always a man involved in these changes, and there's a sense that she leaves all of these things behind for another man, Axel. Question 3, what is her want? Want here is what the character is trying to achieve in Act 2 of the film, from the moment they really begin their journey until the moment they are at their most defeated. As such, it is a SMART goal, in that it is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and normally, but not so much in this film, time-bound. Now, The Worst Person in the World feels quite episodic and quite hard to pin down, doesn't it? Still, there is a few things that we can consider here. At minute 22, Yulia contemplates Axel as he plays with some young kids, and the question is raised, will Yulia have a child? At minute 93, Yulia discovers that she is pregnant. Despite the somewhat episodic nature of the journey, the tangible question of pregnancy undeniably gives the story an overall shape, I think. But you might point out, is this really what Yulia wants, or what she's trying to achieve throughout Act 2? It's not exactly 71 minutes of her trying to get, or not to get, pregnant. But she does tell Axel during their argument that she does want kids, eventually. But she's just not sure what has to happen first. There's a sense that she feels that she needs to grow up a bit, or at least feel more grounded or less unsure of herself. But also, this is a film clearly about modern relationships, and Yulia is always in a relationship. So let me say imperfectly then that Yulia wants to feel truly settled, to find her place in the world within a relationship before she gets pregnant. Question 4. What is her need? Need is the human quality or piece of wisdom that the character lacks at the beginning of the story. Once again, this question of whether there's a character arc or not comes up, but Yulia is certainly different at the end than she is at the beginning. And as we'll see, this is clearly charted, I think, in the key moments of the story, just as you would expect. So, what is her need then? Well, there's probably a few ways to think about it, but I'm inclined to think that Yulia needs to really think about herself on her own terms. She needs to stand on her own 2 feet, or perhaps you could say she needs the confidence to give herself the time to do so. On this note, another criticism that came up of the film was that Yulia is too defined by her relationships. Now, maybe that's true, but personally I'm inclined to think that that's the whole point, as I'll talk about later. Question 5. Does she get what she wants and or what she needs? So, Yulia never really gets that fully settled in a relationship feeling that she seems to be seeking, but she does get what she needs, a life and a career on her own terms. Okay, so now that I've attempted to answer the 5 key questions, let's have a look at the worst person in the world's sequences. There are normally, but not always, 8 sequences or stages in a film. A sequence is a combination of scenes that are tied together by having a single overriding dramatic question or tension, and they tend to be between 10 and 15 minutes in length. A good way to think about it is that every 10 to 15 minutes, the audience should be on some level asking themselves a different dramatic question. Now, it should be pointed out here that The Worst Person in the World divides itself into chapters, 14 in total, 12 plus a prologue and epilogue. But I would still say that these basically break into 8 pretty clean stages of the story. So that's the main framework that I'll be using throughout. So, we start with sequence 1, Life as It Is, or as the film calls it, the prologue. Yulia, we are told immediately, is disappointed in herself. We discover that Yulia is experiencing what so many young people do these days. School is like a train track, and then you get off the train, off the fixed track, and you're suddenly told to figure your own way forward. As soon as the fixed track gets taken away, Yulia begins to struggle with really a combination of her privileged position and her own talent. It's just she has too many options. So she ends up trying a variety of things, and nothing seems to stick. But she does enjoy photography, which opens up a whole new world to her, and that includes setting her up for her inciting incident, the event without which our story as it is would not happen. So, 5 minutes in, Yulia meets Axel, an older comic book artist, and he stresses the word artist. Yulia moves in with him and all seems well, so it's time we get this story really going. Yulia's way of coping is about to be disrupted, and so at minute 9, we enter sequence 2. Sequence 2, or here chapter 1, is intriguingly titled The Others. And really, it's about the external pressures on her relationship with Axel. They spend a weekend with his friends, or possibly family, I'm not sure. They're older, and she feels out of place. And then one of their kids has a bit of a meltdown, as they're liable to do, and it draws out the tension between her and Axel about her not being ready to have kids. And I feel so sorry for Yulia here, because whether Axel is just a different type of person, or is just older and has forgotten what it's like to be her age, he cannot seem to see her point. She doesn't have a list of boxes that need to be ticked and then, boom, ready for babies. She just knows what she feels, that she's not ready now.
Jeg har null morsinstinkt, du ser jo selv.
Nei, du hadde jo blitt en fantastisk mamma. Det er jeg helt sikker på.
Jeg vil ha det. Jeg vil ha barn. På et eller annet tidspunkt.
Hva er det vi venter på sånn helt konkret? Hva er det du vil skal skje før vi får et barn?
Nei, jeg vet ikke hva det er. Men jeg vil jo ha gjort mer ting først.
Ok, hva er det du skal gjøre? Hva er det? Hva er det som står i veien?
It is also worth noting here that the following night, things get a little younger in spirit and more Yulia's speed. There's music and there's dancing. She insists the mom from the previous episode comes out dancing, and said mom hits her head off a light bulb. It's not really Yulia's fault, but she feels responsible, and basically she feels guilty about being younger and seemingly immature. Accidents don't really happen so much when you're just sitting around a table drinking wine talking about how young people these days think they know everything. So Yulia feels guilty, and then the couple, who have a massive blowout from the accident, make up the following day, which seems to support Axel's point that people figure things out as they go. And right after seeing this, Yulia turns to see Axel playing with the kids. So Yulia feels guilty for not being more of a grown-up, and Axel seems to have a point, so we have our big question. Will Yulia have kids? And so, at minute 22, we end Act 1, and we enter Act 2. Act 2 begins with Sequence 3, the first attempts to solve the problem. It's also characterized by what we could term the refusal of the call. The hero is called to their need, and they initially refuse. And so, this is Chapter 2 here, titled Cheating. Our sequence tension is, unsurprisingly, something along the lines of, will Yulia cheat on Axel? Now, right at the bridge between Act 1 and Act 2, we also tend to have what we can call a what's the plan scene, wherein we see basically what our long Act 2 is going to look like. And so we begin by seeing Yulia lonely and directionless, and distracting herself with the novelty of other people. We cut back to the opening shot of the film, which shows Yulia alone and clearly lonely. She is once again out of place in a world that is entirely Axel's. Where are her friends at this thing? Does she even have any, or has she let herself and her world be defined by her relationship with Axel? There is a problem here. She leaves the party, and in a foreshadowing of the climax, she must be considering an end to her life as she knows it with Axel, and she watches the sky after sunset. But this is the refusal of the call, so rather than embrace the pain and uncertainty of loneliness, Yulia crashes a wedding and spends the evening not cheating with extreme prejudice with big, strapping lug Ivan. And it's probably worth noting that they first bond over Yulia's giving one of those women who talk about nothing but their own motherhood some serious trolling. As we'll see throughout, Ivan kind of represents the opposite of Axel. Axel wants Yulia to grow up and become a mother already. Ivan doesn't want kids, wears hoodies and works in a cafe, something I relate to very much, but many would consider a Peter Pan refusing to grow up. Now, I love this sequence, it's fantastic. The film doesn't just show a meet cute and cut to the typical, couple in middle distance laughing while music plays montage. It really spends time here with these two and shows who they are with each other. And there's one key point here. When they both reveal secrets to each other, Yulia tells Ivan a deeply private sexual driver for her, and Ivan realizes that he's misunderstood and has a much less insightful disclosure that he likes Oslo's city centre architecture. Their connection is shown, they're both fun and playful, but also this eventual schism lying underneath their relationship is foreshadowed too, that Yulia just has deeper, or at least more personally focused interests and questions. But this night of fun eventually comes to an end, and at minute 36, Yulia finally accepts the call. Or you could say she makes her first unconscious move towards her need. She does not kiss Ivan, and refuses to learn his name for fear that she would impulsively look him up.
Okay?
Hva heter du for noe?
Julia.
Jeg heter Eivind. Eivind.
Ikke si det.
Hvorfor ikke det?
For da bare finner jeg deg på Facebook, og så...
Ja. Det er lurt.
Ok?
Ok.
Ha det.
Ha det.
We've answered our sequence tension, Yulia did not cheat, so it's time for sequence 4, the greater attempts to solve the problem. Now, this is where things get a little messier, partially because the chapters start varying in length much more and don't correspond directly to the traditional story stages. Overall, though, there's a clear kind of, sense of shit or get off the pot element here, right? As we wonder, will Yulia find a way to express herself truly in her relationship with Axel? Right off the bat, you could easily convince me here that what happens next is really Yulia's first unconscious move towards her need. But, it doesn't really matter which one it is. It much more matters just the overall story shape. So at home, she wants to tell Axel something, perhaps about her night with Ivan, but Axel is too occupied with his work. Removed from her relationship with a man now, she begins to express herself on her own terms, and she writes the article Oral Sex in the Age of Me Too, which certainly explores ideas of her own relationship with men, I think. She shows it to Axel, and it becomes a bit of a thing online, which is great, and surely a sign that Yulia has both talent and something to say. But then time keeps passing. We soon see Yulia turn 30, which is again riddled with the shadows cast over her freer spirit. Her father has not turned up at the small get-together for one, and once again there are no actual friends here. And further, she can't help but consider how all of her female ancestors had had children by the time they were her age. A visit to her tragicomically self-involved father then reveals that he hasn't even considered reading her article, and then ends with Axel telling her that she has to make her own family. So yes, it's nice that she wrote an article, but there's more pressure than ever on Yulia now to just do the adult thing, quote unquote, push that existential dread right down, and just have a child already. So at that, we begin chapter 5. And our attention really crystallizes now into something much more like, will Yulia dump Axel for Ivan? We have back-to-back scenes here with Ivan re-entering our story and Yulia clearly feeling distant from Axel. Ivan wanders around her bookshop with his current partner and sneaks back in to tell her where he works. It's fun and it's brightly lit and it's full of life and play. Then we cut to a dimly lit kitchen at night, and Yulia is practically shrouded in darkness, physically and psychologically distanced from Axel and, again, his friends. Now, I know Ivan isn't enough for Yulia in the end, but I am so on Team Ivan. Axel might be the one who Yulia could have ended up with in the end, but anyone who even gets involved in a conversation about creating an iconic butthole has real potential to be an iconic butthole. Now, right around here, there is a lot to say. We're approaching the worst person in the world's midpoint, but also its most iconic moment, Yulia's freezing time. It's the kind of thing that will be used in montages of great films for decades. I have to note, it is also highly reminiscent of a film that I also completely adore, Miranda July's The Future, which also has a character freeze time right before a breakup right in the middle of our film. So Yulia considers whether or not to break up with Axel, and then right before she does so, she flicks a switch and freezes time. She runs carefree through the streets and finds Ivan, and the two share a wondrous loved-up day together. Now, many have pointed out that this is a great expression of the duality of the fear and pain of ending one relationship whilst simultaneously starting a new exciting one. But we are really close to our midpoint here, or the protagonist's first conscious move towards her need. And I can't help but look at Yulia's joyous face in these moments and think about how she is emancipating herself from the pressures of the ticking clock. She is literally making time for herself here. One more note on this, at the midpoint there is usually a clear foreshadowing of the climactic action. And that's certainly the case with Yulia breaking up with Axel in a moment, but also note that the end of her day with Ivan and the end of her time with Axel is signaled by a sunrise. 33 minutes ago she considered the sky at dusk as she thought about her troubles with Axel. Here, it signals her to return and break up with Axel. And later, a sunrise will... well, we'll get to that. Now, we know Yulia is going to dump Axel, so we move into what I would consider sequence 6 here, or the 5th stage of our story, the honeymoon sequence. It's not the most typical of honeymoon sequences in that it is defined really by hard scenes and emotional tumult, but it is Yulia doing what Yulia needs to do. So she returns to Axel, and at minute 58 into a 121-minute runtime, so almost exactly halfway, Yulia breaks up with Axel, the definitive first conscious move towards her need.
Aksel, må snakke med deg.
But we still have a tension here, which is, will Yulia actually leave? It takes her like 8 minutes. And what follows is a heart-wrenching depiction of a breakup between two people who still love each other, but who are just not meant to be with each other. At least not right now. And it does a great job of showing that. Ivan has his flaws, but he gives Yulia more space in the relationship. Axel starts telling her, right in this argument, what she's doing and why she's doing it. As she says herself, sometimes she just wants to feel things. You could say that she needs to be herself on her own terms. But the next thing she says is perhaps equally telling. She is terrified of being alone, that when she left him, she would feel like Bambi on the ice. She says she knows that that's exactly why she has to do it. But this is our midpoint, not our climax. So when Yulia walks out that door, she is not actually planning on being alone. She's walking straight into another relationship. And so we have another brief chapter, chapter 6, where we see Ivan struggling in his relationship. Now, this chapter I think is important for a few reasons. First of all, it is, as I'll discuss more later, perhaps the clearest expression of someone being hemmed in and arguably changing who they are in a relationship. Second, it says the title of our film, which is always nice. And finally, it has one of my favorite dissolves that I can think of. At exactly 71 minutes, 17 seconds, Ivan is framed by a small window, solemnly contemplating. But it is also dissolving from the previous scene where he is watching Yulia dancing wildly. So visually, this box with Ivan inside it is itself in Yulia's head for a brief moment. Is he in her head as she is in his? It's a great example of what a dissolve can do when used appropriately. At that, at minute 71, we begin chapter 7, appropriately titled A New Chapter. And the lovers are finally together. Now, I would argue that the moment these two actually get together, we have ironically finished our honeymoon period, and we're now, broadly speaking, in our 6th stage of our story, the bridge from the honeymoon to the low point. First of all, because we have a new tension, which is something like, will Yulia fall in love with Ivan? But also because the moment she starts dating Ivan, Yulia is not really engaging in her need anymore. We see them having passionate sex once, and then she seems to move in immediately. What happened to Bambi on ice, Yulia? But there's no denying that Ivan has real charm. He doesn't want kids, so there's no pressure there, and he takes Yulia as she is. In some ways, perhaps even too much so. In chapter 8, Yulia's narcissistic circus, we see Yulia with her new boyfriend's friend circle, and it is undeniably more her speed. They take some mushrooms at her behest. In the bad trip that follows, amongst other things, Yulia seems to confront a lot of inner demons. Her exes, her distant father, and perhaps most curiously, Axel, his bobcat creation, and motherhood. This is the worst person in the world at its most freewheeling, let's say. So I am reluctant to overanalyze here with too much confidence, but Bobcat's whole thing is that he is a wild animal, and earlier Axel has lamented the removal of his iconic butthole as a kind of anesthetizing bourgeois measure. So it seems relevant here that as Yulia suddenly has a child to nurse, Bobcat has his iconic butthole pulled off. But when the baby laughs at this, Bobcat becomes irate, eats the baby, and burps. I would be inclined to think that Yulia, as someone who also felt defined by Axel, associates herself with Bobcat here, and fears that her own wildness cannot be anesthetized by motherhood, and that her wildness could hurt her child. But I may be wildly overreaching there, and that interpretation could be entirely wrong. At any rate, the following morning we see Ivan, lovely, accepting Ivan, take great care of Yulia, and that night she thanks him for accepting her as herself. But then we have a subtly really big moment, and I can't believe I didn't notice it the first couple of times I watched this film. Ivan says he loves her, and Yulia does not say it back. Rather, she turns and looks off into the distance, quite worried. It would appear that Yulia will not fall in love with Ivan after all. But now, as we move into the final sequence of Act 2, we have another tension. Will Yulia act on the fact that she does not love Ivan? And so we see Axel begin to re-enter her life. First, she sees him getting into a feisty culture war argument on TV, and then she discovers that he has incurable cancer. She is devastated, and perhaps begins to think about what they had again. Which leads to our next scene, a confrontation with Ivan. Now, I've talked to some people who have taken her side and said that Ivan had no business reading her story, but it was sitting on top of the bin, unfolded. I don't know if I would have read it, but when it's not a diary entry or anything, I definitely wouldn't rule it out, and nor would I blame a partner for doing the same. Anyways, there's a lot going on here. It's interesting to note that Yulia is at first kind of charmed by the fact that he likes her story, until he makes the mistake of showing that he knows it's her family. At that, she very quickly turns and becomes pretty cruel. She derides him for not being literary, which is a horrible, obnoxious thing to do. And then we get to the real crux of it. She won't relax about it, because apparently relaxing is his thing. He has no ambition, but she does.
Ja.
Det forstår du.
Jo, men kan du bare slappe av?
Slappe av?
Ja, kan du ta det med ro?
Slappe av. Det er du jævlig god på. Du kan slappe av og servere kaffe til du er 50. Jeg vil noe mer.
Jeg er lei meg for det, liksom. Jeg vet ikke hva jeg skal gjøre.
And frankly, Ivan is a saint here. He doesn't react, but just admits that he is hurt. So Axel was pushing too hard for Yulia to grow up, settle down, and become a mother already. But Ivan does not push Yulia at all. But really, the problem, not really the fault, but the problem here is with Yulia. When Ivan reads out her prose, she's embarrassed by it. After all this time, she has not figured out a way to really express herself on her own terms. She has not found something meaningful to do with herself. And then we transition to chapter 11, and the beginning of our end, with Yulia discovering that she is pregnant. Yulia can't seem to find that settled feeling in a relationship, but now trying to find it outside of a relationship would be harder than ever. Like at so many low points, our protagonist finds herself no longer believing the counter-argument, but the argument seems impossible. And so, at minute 93, with 28 minutes left, we end Act 2 and we enter Act 3. Act 3 has a false resolution and a true resolution. In the false resolution sequence, and it's one hell of a sequence, Yulia stays uncommunicative with Ivan and decides to visit Axel. We learn that she is taking steps towards her need, though, as she has cut off communication with her father. But without wanting to be too morbid here, there is a real sense of the ticking clock once again, as Axel now talks not only about his impending death, but also of a youth that is gone forever. Suddenly, it's not just that the future is coming, but that the past is gone. And even if you try to continue living youthfully, you will cease to be youthful. Axel tells her that he had still been doing the same things that he used to do long after they gave him the same feelings they once had. Julia's time on this earth will be short-lived, and she will need to find some way to grow up. So Axel tells her if the father is kind, she should keep the baby. But this is our false resolution, and approaching our true resolution, a tearful Axel reveals that his one regret was not convincing Julia of how great she was. Perhaps then they would have been more equal partners, and Julia would have had more space. But who's to say? At that, Julia goes home and tells Ivan that she's pregnant, and that she needs time to think. So it's about time for the worst person in the world's true resolution, the appropriately titled Chapter 12, Everything Comes to an End. This is a slightly unusual final sequence, and I'll talk about it a bit more later, but I think it's because this is a hard story to end as such. So much of this final act feels like it belongs to Axel really more than Julia, and so much of what happens to Julia, which appears to make her a little passive in the home stretch, at least at first blush. But again, I'll talk about this in a moment. For now, Julia is very much reconnecting with Axel in his final days, and it's worth noting that she is kind of interviewing him while photographing him. So she has finally been inspired by Axel to express herself on her own terms. Then he wishes that he weren't dying. Now he doesn't care about his art anymore, but would just like to live happily with her. But sadly, it's too late for that. For them. Julia soon gets a call to say it's unlikely that Axel will live through the night. She wanders the streets all night, grief-stricken, and then, as before, the sunrise signals another end for her and Axel. The night is over, and Axel has most likely passed. Then, during a shower, Julia miscarries. Jesus, wasn't this a comedy at some stage? But at that, with mere minutes to go, we cut to an epilogue, and we discover that Julia is now a stills photographer on a film set. Now, this must be a reference to Annie Hall, I feel, where the protagonist in a story about a relationship that doesn't work out ends up on a film set recreating a breakup. It's probably also worth noting that there's a female actress here struggling to give the male director what he wants. But most importantly, when we first met Julia, she was dropping medicine for psychology and then psychology for photography. After interviewing and photographing Axel, she now directs the actress in a way that the actual director did not. She helps the actress to use her emotions to help her take the best photograph, combining her initial passions, which is a nice touch. Julia then, to her astonishment, watches that actress walk out and meet her former partner, Ivan, who is holding their baby.
Men för att det är skickligt dåligt.
Men bruk det da. Vær i det du er i nå.
Ja,
Hvis du ser her var han satt.
okej.
Our protagonist goes home, and with the drawing of Bobcat with a female partner on her windowsill, she gets to work. Normally, I try not to react to criticisms of film because if I can, I want to try to overanalyze a film as much as possible on its own terms. But I decided here to structure this section a little bit on criticisms because I did find them to be an interesting prompt into how to consider the story. So I'd like to look at two of the main criticisms of the story and then consider where they might be coming from. First of all, on the notion that Julia is overly defined by her relationships, I think that is probably the whole point, even if, admittedly, it does seem a little unnatural that we never see Julia with her own friends. And this idea is not only presented by the key moments in Julia's story, but also especially by Ivan. We see Ivan with 3 different partners. When Julia meets him, he's dating yogi and environmental Instagrammer Soniva. And so we see Ivan not only worry about the environment, but also become really guilt-ridden over it. And then, while dating Yulia, he insists that he doesn't want kids, perhaps because of a hangover from Sunniva, or perhaps he's not ready, or perhaps because Yulia has just left a relationship where there was so much pressure to have kids. And while Yulia is enjoying going with the flow, so is Ivan. Finally, he ends up with the actress that Yulia photographs, and with a baby to boot. Of course, we don't really know the nature of this relationship, but it seems clear that Ivan is at least partially redefined by it, as we all naturally are by relationships, and certainly as Yulia is throughout. The story is really her journey to not be defined by her relationships, but to spend the hard time finding out what she wants to do alone. So, relatedly, I think the idea that she has a flat character arc is not really fair either, but it is more interesting, at least for a story structure nerd. So, we can see through the second act that there is a clear character arc here, I think, with Yulia moving both towards and away from her need as one would expect in any story. For her first unconscious move, she does not run straight into the embrace of another man and begins to express herself creatively. At the midpoint, her first conscious move, she breaks up with Axel and at least contemplates how she needs to be alone to figure herself out. Then, as the honeymoon period ends, she does not embrace that need and falls straight back into a live-in relationship with Ivan. At the low point, it appears like she might never get that time to be alone as she becomes pregnant. So, where does this sense of a shallow arc come from then? Well, I think it probably has to do with the ending. The story does feel a little like it stops more than ends, and that's probably at least partially because so much of the true resolution appears to happen to Yulia. Axel is the one putting everything into context, then he dies. She also just happens to see Ivan with his new partner, and of course, most significantly, Yulia miscarries. Now, I hate using this term, but purely in story terms, this is kind of convenient. Before this happens, Yulia really has 4 choices. Keep the baby and stay with Ivan, keep the baby and leave Ivan, have an abortion and stay with Ivan, or have an abortion and leave Ivan. None of these feel ideal for Yulia, so the choice she made would feel truly significant, truly weighty. A character's arc is defined by choices, and this feels like the biggest choice Yulia would have to make, by some distance really. And to some degree, the hardest aspect of that choice is made for her by the story. Now, there are real reasons for this, of course. Firstly, I am hardly the person to be talking about this, but it's hard to imagine a film ending with an abortion and not becoming about abortion. And this film is not about that. Secondly, this is a film about being buffeted by external factors. Yulia begins our story being distracted by unsolvable global problems. Ivan wanders into her life twice. Axel suddenly gets cancer unusually young. Yulia gets pregnant by accident. So it is kind of in keeping with the story that this might happen to Yulia. Having said all that, of course, Yulia does make a choice. She makes a choice that she would not have made at any other point in the film, I think. She chooses to be alone. If that feels like a stop rather than an end, well, that's probably because this is a period in life that doesn't really have a natural end. Youth has gone, but old age is still a ways away. She may or may not meet someone. She may or may not have kids. She may or may not achieve the artistic or professional objectives that she has. But what she can know for sure is that she's tried, that she stood on her own 2 feet, and gave figuring it all out a real go. This has been Mark Overanalyzes Film. Somehow I've gone 22 episodes without overanalyzing a Coen Brothers movie, and this aggression will not stand, man. So next time, to mark 25 glorious abiding years, it's The Big Lebowski. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, rate, follow, recommend, and whatever else is good for this kind of thing. A special thanks to Mary Kate O'Flanagan, who taught me everything I know about film, including these methods. Thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and see you soon.